Yesterday I spoke to Michael Karadjis, who writes a powerful blog and often comments about Syria. We talked about starvation in Syrian towns under the siege. Karadjis demolished the claims by Assad supporters that the suffering of civilians was faked. Today I want to talk with him about the United Nations and what it's doing or not doing. Once again, Karadjis is in Sydney, Australia, and teaches at Australian Catholic University and the University of Sydney. Good morning.
Good morning, Stan. Good morning, everyone.
Before we talk about the UN, I wanted to ask you how you got interested in the Middle East and in Syria in particular.
Okay. I suppose I've been interested in politics for many, many decades, and specifically the Middle East was probably around the time of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. And in fact, I was close by in Greece at the time, so it had quite a big impact there. And when I got back to Australia, I was one of the earliest people involved in the Palestine Human Rights Campaign, which was the main organisation throughout the 1980s that was involved in Palestine work in Australia. And so I've maintained an interest in Palestine solidarity and therefore in other Middle Eastern issues ever since. And for me, obviously, probably like for you and many others, the Arab Spring uprisings were quite a decisive moment. Certainly I see that the uprising of the people in Syria and other parts of the Middle East is in the long run, the best chance for the Palestinians trying to rely on these horrible regimes which have never helped them. In fact, it has always been a dead end. Maybe they had no choice, but now we are hoping for the victory of people over dictatorships in the Middle East.
And unlike a lot of the left, you didn't drift into the camp that said only the U.S. was the bad guys, and you stuck with the analysis that Assad and his crew were doing some pretty horrible things.
Yeah, well, they certainly were. I mean, there's 2 points there. First of all, of course, it's never a simplistic thing that only one group or one power is responsible for all crimes. That's absurd. Secondly, of course, the problem with all that analysis, even on its own terms, is that the Assad regime has never been an anti-imperialist force in the region. It's obviously got its own interests, like everybody has, but at all kinds of decisive points, it was ready to collaborate with the US, from the invasion of Lebanon in 1976, where they came in against the left and the Palestinians, right up to taking part in the Bush regime's renditions and torture in the last decade. So, I mean, this is they've also constantly part of the reason, perhaps, that I was willing to take an anti-Assad stand was precisely because I remember the 80s when the Assad regime constantly attacked the Palestinian resistance, including launching a full-scale, a full year of war on the camps via its allies of Lebanon. So I never had any illusions about that anyway.
All right, let's talk now about the United Nations. Recently, there was a letter by 112 Syrians to Stephen O'Brien, who's the UN Undersecretary for Humanitarian Affairs.
Yeah.
In part, it says, in many besieged areas, such as those around Damascus, UN warehouses full of life-saving aid are often just minutes away. Yeah. You, meaning the UN, are choosing not to deliver that aid to us, not because of danger from non-state groups who are prepared to give safety assurances, but because the Assad regime is not giving you permission. So is the UN just more or less doing what Assad wants?
Well, but in effect, yes. I mean, obviously, it's more complicated than that, and behind the UN are the powers that do have some sort of ability to move things along. But ultimately, yes, that I mean, how can you argue with the fact that there's all this food right there? And not only that, but also the fact that the UN does supply lots of food to Assad-controlled regions, tons and tons and tons of it, right? But it simply says, oh, okay, we can't even attempt to go into these places because the regime says no. UN resolutions give the UN the right to deliver food to these starving places. I mean, ultimately, if they tried to forcibly go and deliver food and the Assad regime forcibly stopped them, well, okay, well, then you'd have a case. Okay, we tried, and they forcibly stop us, and then that would be an international issue that the regime is preventing food deliveries. But I mean, there's been no attempt. They simply say, well, okay, well, we can't do it. Their own resolutions say that they can. What's the point of these resolutions?
And these are UN Security Council. It's not just the General Assembly. It's the ones that are supposed to be international law.
Well, that's right. It's the Security Council, and the Security Council consists of powers such as the US and Russia. Russia, of course, has been airdropping aid to pro-regime areas. It's only the Western powers that are not prepared to drop aid to anti-regime areas. It's a political decision more than a practical decision.
The letter by those Syrian mentions Deir ez-Zor, which is under a siege by ISIS and I guess Assad too, and even that gets no food from the UN.
Part of the problem with Deir ez-Zor is that at the moment it's divided between ISIS and the Assad regime, but originally Deir ez-Zor was one of the first centers of the anti-Assad uprising. So the regime has no love for the majority of people in the area that it controls. That area is under siege by ISIS, but the regime itself essentially besieges it as well by saying that it's too dangerous for the UN to bring food in there, and yet at the same time the regime itself flies planes in every single day to supply its troops. So the activists, and they say that, these 112 activists say that in that letter, that quite clearly the regime is making a decision that it doesn't want to, that it basically wants to strangle this town itself.
So in terms of the UN, we say UN, but who is it that's not allowing the UN to bring in food? Is it Russia, Iran? Is it more than that?
I don't. Sorry, I don't have the details of the internal workings of the UN and the whatever Machiavellian kind of things are going on there. I mean, but quite clearly you've got a situation where the most powerful state in the world, the United States, has been dropping bombs on Syria and on Iraq for something like 16 months. The simple demand to drop food rather than bombs, because food will actually help people eat, seems to me quite a simple and powerful demand. I mean, if the argument is, well, we can't go and just send our air force into Syria to drop food because that's a sovereign state, well, then how can you be dropping bombs for 16 months on this state? I mean, there's no argument. All the arguments about practicalities too are there. If it was consistent, you might say, oh well, it's always been like that. But we saw that they dropped food to the Yazidis in Iraq. Whatever practical difficulties they may have had there. But it seems to me that when you start talking about these practical difficulties in such a situation where it's so desperate, and then when a situation's so desperate, obviously you have to make certain choices. It seems to me in this situation, this is basically political. They are. I'm not saying that they want people to starve. I simply think that they don't particularly care. They see no strategic benefit in helping these anti-Assad towns. Basically, the overall political situation at the moment is that the US, the West, Russia, the Assad regime, and the local powerful states are in on this Vienna peace process. Obviously, any process that would end the fighting would be a good thing to some extent, but the particular outline of it seems to be that the Assad regime, which has been responsible for over 90% of all killings in Syria, is to remain in power for another 1.5 years in a so-called transitional regime, which will give it, an enormous amount of time to strangle its opponents. Since this announcement, it's essentially been going for broke. I mean, their Russian allies have been bombing throughout the south where there's no ISIS, and the regime has been stepping up the strangulation of these towns around Damascus. These are all the centres of the opposition from the start. When you put it together with things like we've just heard in the last few days that the Amman operations room in Jordan has basically told the rebels in the south, the southern front, the most, say, secular, democratic section of the resistance, has told them, stop fighting Assad, focus all your fire on al-Nusra. These are, in other words, these are political orders coming through via Amman from the West.
Now, people might be surprised. I mean, some on the left here just think the U.S. has been trying its hardest to overthrow Assad, and behind the scenes secretly and all that. How do you see it?
How do I see that? Well,
That's scary that the U.S. is trying to overthrow Assad.
The U.S. has never wanted to overthrow Assad. The U.S. has never wanted, in people's uprisings to overthrow anyone. I mean, obviously, it did reach a certain point where Obama said, okay, Assad should step down. That was something like 8 months into the uprising after thousands and thousands of people had been killed. But the idea of step down is that, well, Assad and maybe his immediate, the people immediately around him need to step down in order to save the regime, because it can't save itself if it's being so divisive. I mean, that's no different to the fact that the US accepted Mubarak stepping down at the last minute as well. That doesn't mean the US was out to get Mubarak. The US has said all along that the regime needs to be preserved, and its spokespeople have even made it quite explicit that means the military, police and security apparatus as well. To the extent that arms have gone into some of the opposition, it's mainly been from neighbouring states, not from the US. To the extent that the US has allowed some of that, the US has tended to play the role of restricting it as much as possible in order to have some sort of control over who the opposition is, and it's continually drawn red lines and so on. I mean, this is perhaps outside the bounds of this particular interview, and it's quite a long story. But to cut it very short, perhaps we could say that if the US really was supporting the resistance to the regime, then they would allow their allies in the region to supply the kinds of weapons that were appropriate given the kinds of weaponry the regime is using, which since the middle of 2012 has been massive air power.
Right. I want to get back to. I'm sorry.
Sorry. Yes, okay. So I'm just saying, and the best weapons are anti-tank weapons, which even they were blocked by the US for several years. They're allowing some to go through now, but I mean they're the kind of weapons they needed about 3 years ago.
I wanted to get back to the question of food and airdrops.
Yeah.
In your post, you said that the slogan "Drop food, not bombs" has been being advanced by many activists.
Yeah.
And so the question comes: is it practical for the UN or the US to drop food? And today, the New York Times had an article where they featured a congressman who said it was too risky to drop food to Madaya and these other places. I wonder if you had seen it and what you thought of it.
Well, I mean, it's like I said. I think these are questions of priorities. I mean, there are going to be risks in anything you do, but it seems to me when they want to do something such as drop food, that they will do it. I mean, they've said that there's risks to the aircraft. Now, I mean, if as I said, they've been dropping bombs for 16 months. Now, I hate ISIS as much as I hate the regime, but this, in my opinion, this bombing doesn't help defeat ISIS. If anything, it helps it grow in a certain sense, given that they're not touching the regime, which most Syrians see as much more dangerous. Now, actually, those airplanes dropping food wouldn't be violating anybody's sovereignty any more than what they're already doing, if that's the issue. If the Assad regime were to threaten to shoot down a plane that was dropping food, once again, that would be, quite a significant international incident.
But if the Russians fired near a plane or at a plane, some people say, you in the peace movement, you're risking getting us into some big war.
Well, the Russians themselves are dropping food. I think look, Israel has continually just zapped into the south, bombed some targets that it wanted to bomb and return quickly. The Syrian regime has never challenged them, either because they don't particularly care, and or because the ability of of Israeli aircraft, they're advanced enough to be able to zap in very quickly, do what they want to do, and get out. And it seems to me that the US and Britain and countries like that also have that ability to zap in, avoid the air defense system, drop food, and move on. I would say I'm not absolute expert on that, but experts have been saying that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we want to close with that. I just mentioned to the viewers that there's a petition campaign going on in the United States and in Britain, basically on the theme of drop food, not bombs. Code Pink and the Middle East Crisis Committee and Promoting Enduring Peace doing it in the U.S., and then a more successful one in Britain. And the last time I looked, 57,000 people had called on the RAF to drop food.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a good campaign.
All right. Well, I want to thank you again for speaking about this.
Thanks for inviting me, Stanley, and good luck with the program. Okay, we're moving to the US.
And thank all of you for watching. This is Stanley Heller for The Struggle.